Okay, we're back, and joining us now is Major Adam Dortona, active duty, U.S. Army, regular Army, I like to say. Mm-hmm. And he's going to join us along with Brandon, also regular Army. And we want to talk about leadership, toxic, non-toxic, good, bad, otherwise. And then we'll talk a little bit more about lawfare and its impact. We will probably also touch again on some health matters, but what we want to do now is focus on leadership from the vantage point of people who see it every day in their lives, wherever they are. And we're not suggesting if there's something bad comes up that it's everywhere, but at least we have people who are willing to talk about it honestly and openly. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Major Dortona. Tell us about leadership in the United States Army.
I'll do the best I can, Colonel Macgregor. Figure it out. Yeah, I mean, where do you begin, right? I mean, we've made a lot of changes to the way that we select leaders in specifically the last 5 years or so, since we've started our assessment programs for command. And I think that's been a detriment to...
Detrimental?
I do. I really do. And that's based on experience. I haven't gone through these assessment programs, but I've talked to folks, and I've been very close to folks who I've served under who have.
Now, these are the peer ratings that we're dealing with?
Correct, yeah. So there's the Commander's Assessment Program. It works for the 06 level if you want to command a brigade or a regiment, and at the 05 level, battalion command.
Right.
And at the battalion command level, it's worth, this assessment program, it's 4 days, it's worth 60% of your evaluation to be able to be a commander and get on the OML, from what I understand. If you're a full bird colonel, it's 50%. It's significant, and it's only 4 days long. And a huge...
And is this where you sit with your peers and go through this, or is this done individually?
It's done individually. You go there with your peers as a group, but you'll negotiate it on an individual basis. You'll sit in front of panels and stuff like that, talk. But one of the huge inputs to that process is subordinate feedback. And I think we can all agree that some subordinate feedback is necessary. It's a good thing, right? We want to know where our blind spots are. We want someone that looks at us at a different light, shine some awareness on us about what's going on. But it's weighted very heavily because there are psychologists that work on that panel that aren't... It's kind of like the Delta Force one.
I'm not familiar with that.
The Delta Force has special operations forces, from what I understand. They have psychiatrists who can see if you're actually crazy or something, and then decide.
Well, that's helpful. We need more of them.
Yeah, you think? Yeah.
Might not have the same general officer corps.
Right. Well, that's a whole other can of worms right there. Right. But there's psychologists. They take all this data in, and they can decide pretty much whether or not you command or not. Right. And I think, so far, it does a pretty good job at identifying which leaders are toxic, but it throws the baby out with the bathwater between toxic and hard folks.
I see.
So what ends up happening is you've just got a bunch of leaders that end up going forward who may not be either of those, but they don't have a backbone, they don't have a spine, and they end up in command because
they slip through the net.
But instead of slipping through the net, they are the primary person that will end up commanding something in the future.
Well, when I was in active duty, one of the things that I used to hear was, well, Billy, he's a really good guy and a real war fighter.
Yeah. And
I'd say, what wars has he been in? And what makes him a good guy? And I found that there was a lot of emphasis on, well, he's a guy that you want to have a beer with. And that was something that I remember about Bill Clinton when he ran for office.
Right.
And I've forgotten who it was. I think it was Chris Matthews. He said, what really clinched the election for Bill Clinton is that he's the sort of guy you want to have a beer with. If you were going to sit on an airplane and travel with somebody, he's a good guy to do that with.
Well,
a hell of a lot of criteria for a president that don't make any sense. So is that kind of what you're talking about?
I am, yeah. As someone that's going to be able to kind of game the system before they get to that 4-day assessment, where they don't have to be too hard on their subordinates, and that's a problem, right? Because in combat, war is binary. You win, you lose, you live or die. You want the best chance to be able to survive and win. And, we owe it to the recruits that join us and to their families to give them the best chance to live. And sometimes the person that's in charge of that unit that you join is going to be a hard person. And that's good. Like, think about any mentor that any of us have ever had, right? It's always been someone who's pushed us to the limit and beyond in many cases.
Past our comfort zone.
Right, way past, right? We look back and we go, that was good, it was formative for us, and I'm a better person for it.
Well, now tell me, how do we define toxicity? I mean, I know what I think, but what do you think it means?
I mean, there's some pretty clear indicators that a leader can be toxic, and I think that, you know, we have decent mechanisms to investigate that sort of thing, but really berating people in a way that is not constructive. I think you and I have both seen all of us have all seen situations where we could be made fun of and then end up executing what we need to execute anyway, and it ends up being kind of a funny thing and an engagement between us and the leader. But some leaders are just straight mean, right? For the sake of being mean.
Are you suggesting an officer who humiliates a subordinate commander in front of his soldiers? Because I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen someone brought up at a conference where there were all the majors and lieutenant colonels from 2 cavalry regiments, and I watched one regimental commander bring up someone under him who was a major and then humiliate the man in front of everybody in the room.
Right.
I thought that was toxic.
That's toxic.
And he was very deliberate about it.
Right.
He said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. This is ridiculous. You sit down.
No.
And then this is what this, and it was painful to watch because this man, as far as we could tell, he was a good officer, and he didn't have to do that. But he was very popular. He's someone that all the senior officers wanted to join them, saw him as a future 4-star.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen officers that, as young, promotable captains or majors as field grade staff officers who would say, tell everybody in the unit, now listen, I'm going to make general in this Army, and nobody in here is going to prevent me from getting there.
That sounds pretty toxic.
And that was not that uncommon.
That sounds pretty
when
toxic.
I was in the Army.
Really?
There were many people who did that, and indeed that particular individual became a 4-star.
Wow.
But it's the message.
He wasn't the only one.
The message that's conveyed with that kind of mentality, nobody here is going to stop me. So they're all just
Well,
stepping stones.
You got to remember, it depends on the people at the top, and the people at the top set the tone. And one of the things that people at the top want to be absolutely certain of is that you're ready to do whatever you're told,
Right.
and that you're not going to do anything they don't want you to do, that you're on the team. You're a real team player. So that sounds great in theory, but in practice it's scary.
It's a reasonable expectation to have since we all serve at the pleasure of the president and some of the leaders appointed over us, but it becomes murky when you start defining what it means to win.
Right.
And if there is no threat of a war of national survival, it's very difficult to put the right senior officers in charge, I think, because now you're using some different metric in peacetime to promote these folks. And what ends up happening is, at least in the current Army, and we have a cohort of people that rise to a certain level because they are not risk mitigators. Commanders speak in the language of risk, right? They're risk avoiders because they don't.
Well, you're saying something that's very important, and it's very true. And a lot of Americans don't understand that the last time we, as an Army, faced an existential threat to a field army, one of our field armies, was in Korea, in 1950 and 51. There was a real chance that we could have been driven into the sea and destroyed. And in retrospect, when you look at the relatively small but highly disciplined force that attacked us with, I think, something in the neighborhood of 300 tanks. And again, tanks were largely eliminated from Korea because someone decided the terrain wouldn't support tanks. Well, that never occurred to the North Koreans, who were trained, organized, and equipped by the Soviets. And so 300 tanks attacked, and we fell apart, literally and figuratively. I mean, and unfortunately, there wasn't a great deal that we could do. We weren't really very well prepared, but there was also no accountability for that. No one was ever held accountable for the bad decisions and the performance of the units. And I always point that out because had that been under the Germans during the Second World War or the Soviets, under the Soviets, they'd have simply shot the officers. The Germans would have sent the officers to a penal division to serve time for a year or two because of their failures, and then they would have dealt with individual acts of cowardice. Soviets were more gratuitous with their violence, and they shot lots of people. I'm not advocating that, but we just haven't really done that now. We have Ridgway who comes in. He takes over, has a profound impact, and that's a story worth telling. And it's all about leadership, and taking care of the people that are fighting for you is very important. In other words, convincing the soldier he's not abandoned and that his life is worthless.
Crucially important.
Yeah, and
Well,
I think we've lost that.
There's a loss of accountability at the top. Marcus Aurelius.
Now you're really going back.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius.
Way back.
No, but he talked about being tolerant with others but strict with yourself.
Yes.
So if our leaders held themselves to a higher standard than they hold those below them, these things wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have had the issue with Afghanistan and our withdrawal from Afghanistan. We probably would have been much more successful in our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. But leaders, we had talked about lawfare in the previous discussion. Leaders are allowed to fail at these levels that in some instances cost lives and billions of dollars, and they're promoted. You have, an E4 that's a helicopter mechanic, and he doesn't want to take a shot, and his whole life and career is ruined, thrown out the window. Or somebody like me, I was a W3, I was on the list for W4, and I was, this is my family, it's how I feed my family, 18 years. And my entire career, all of the service, my knowledge, everything is just going to be tossed out the window. Meanwhile, you have individuals that have been chosen for leadership position that their failures will not reflect on their promotion status or their livelihoods.
So they're eminently unqualified, but they're pushed ahead anyway.
We move people up.
And what's the reason that we push them forward?
There's
Unconditional obedience to dumb orders?
Yeah.
I'm asking.
That's kind of what it is.
That's what it feels like. The last
Feels
4
like it.
years especially, it feels very...
Is it also racial? In other words, we have to have the group has to look a certain way. We don't have enough of this or that. In other words, it's, Forrest Gump talks about his candies. You never know till you open it. We have different candies that are in different packages, so we have to have people who are in different packages. Is that part of it?
I know that there has been graphics that are passed around on X and places like that, people that leak things. I've never leaked anything. I've never like that, so I can't speak directly to it. But there have been emails that are people have published.
Well, you can only talk about whatever you've experienced.
Yeah, there's emails and things that people have pushed out and published where there were metrics that were defined as far as going forward.
Well, we talked earlier before this began about the LGBTQ business and mentioned that President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have eliminated that. And you said, well, that's fine, but that's not really getting to the heart of the problem.
No.
And could you explain that in greater detail? And I'd like you to join in on this, Adam, too.
Sure. We can attack these singular issues, right? But when we attack a singular issue, it's like pulling a root, the top of a weed off.
Mm-hmm.
You're not getting the roots. The roots branch out. The roots grow underneath the ground. That weed will return.
Well, you told me that we're not going to bring anybody else into the armed forces who's quote-unquote transgender, and we're not going to cost-free surgically alter them while they're on active duty. But people who have already been through this and are doing it are still retained. So they haven't gone away, and their presence is still disruptive. Is that not correct?
Well, how do I put this? The issue with it is, like I said, is we have to get to the root of what has created this environment, leadership-wise, and those types of things within the military. Is
So
that
what's
is
that
that
root?
the root of the issue?
Well, what is the root then? Adam, what's the root that he's trying to get to?
I mean, we've lost our way when it comes to what our purpose is. Our purpose has been so drastically expanded over the last few years and altered, especially from GWAT, that we forgot that lethality is our main focus. And
we're-
things that make us lethal are the most important. And I'm not talking about, like if we talk about desegregation of the military like President Truman did back in the day. I thought that was good and well executed, and it made us more lethal. This experiment objectively did not. And we saw that with our own eyes, but we allowed other folks to tell us that what we were seeing we shouldn't believe, and diversity is our strength.
Well,
that's a huge problem on the field.
That's been a problem with women. It was never no one ever doubted that women could contribute to things. But there was no understanding. I mean, I've listened to people talk, said, well, we've got women that can do this, and we've got men that can't. And they don't understand the armed forces, especially the Army and the Marines, I would argue, excuse me, it's not about individuals. It's about formations.
That's right.
You build formations, and those formations are like organisms. They have to go into action, whatever that is, for a length of time. They have to sustain losses and continue to survive and fight. And when you introduce disruptive entities into that formation, you risk a loss of cohesion, a breach of discipline,
Divides us.
and more important, a breach of or a loss of focus, as you were pointing out, on what the hell is the purpose here? Is it to accommodate all of these social justice warriors and where they want somebody? Or is it about building fighting power? It was a great book, and I think everybody should read it, written by Martin van Creveld, an Israeli. And it was called Fighting Power, a comparative study of the German and American armies during World War II. It is devastating in its criticism of us. And this is long before the distractions and disruptions that we've been dealing with. And it talks about why the Germans were so much more effective in action than we were. Of course, a lot of people were offended. Well, we won the war.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we didn't win the war. We were part of an alliance. And that included the Soviets, it included the British, and others who fought with us. We took tremendous casualties. And we took heavy casualties against an enemy that had no tactical air support. And that's huge. People don't understand how important that is. They really don't. And the Air Force, of course, has never really been interested in it. They want to go bomb things. And so the Army gets short shrift when it comes to this matter. But these are critical issues. So now you have a chance. You're talking to Secretary Hegseth and President Trump. And I know from having had a personal conversation with him, this is back in November of 2020. He asked me about, the purpose of military bound. I said, well, as an Army officer, I can tell you that when you ask a French Army officer, what is the purpose of the French Army? He immediately tells us, our purpose is to destroy or kill the enemies of the French state. End of discussion.
Yeah, that's
no questions. And I said, you ask somebody that in the U.S. Army or the Marines right now,
You get a million different answers.
you're going to, he says, I hate that.
It's bad, right?
President Trump said, I hate that. And he's right. I said, well, that's got to change. So talk about that. What do we need to do to fix that in your judgment?
I think you're, understanding it as an organism more than an organization. If all the parts of the organism don't function properly, the organism dies.
That's right.
And so when you introduce things into the organism that are not part of its function, I mean, think about a body and cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Cancer eventually will kill the body. Mm-hmm. If you introduce these little things into that organism or that unit, you eventually kill off the lethality of that unit. The idea that we seek out, we close in on, and we destroy the enemies of the United States of America needs to be task number one that we teach.
So we need to make it clear so that anyone who is asked on any given day, what is the purpose of this Army, this Marine Corps, this Navy, this Air Force, whatever, should have a very straightforward, unambiguous answer. And what should that answer be?
We should be able to close with and destroy the enemies of the United States, and deter potential adversaries by our demonstrated ability to do that.
That's right.
Of course.
You know what I mean? That's it. We don't have to throw down overseas and fight, but we need to be able to show the enemy from our own training that we will not stop.
Yes.
And you should think twice before, going counter to our own interests.
Yes.
That's just all it is. It's very simple.
You're also dealing with a lot of people who are going to say to you, a woman may say, I have a right to serve, and I have a right to do this or that while I'm in service. And we talked about rights earlier. No one has the right to serve. Service should be viewed as a privilege or as a duty if it's in fact a full-scale war.
Yeah.
Right.
But nobody has a right to do anything when they enter the armed forces. You have an obligation to do what is in the best interests of the institution, and that means of the force, and that means of the formation of which you are part.
And that's going back to World War II.
tools.
I think that's something that we understood fundamentally, was that people had their place. Some people stayed in the United States and worked in factories and made sure that there were bullets and vehicles for the fighting men that were overseas in Europe. The men that were chosen to go fight went and they fought. They fought out of a sense of duty and honor. I can't say all of them did, but the majority did, and we were able to close in on and destroy the enemy of the United States at that time.
Adam?
The issue that we have now, going back to the original point about what we can do to get us back to being lethal, is essentially changing what happened in around 2003 when we started implementing regulations like Army Regulation 350-1, mandatory training. We started the whole ARFA-Gen process where we were just going to churn out units to go over to the fight, the long guard shift over in Iraq and Afghanistan, come back, send someone else over, do it again, right? We still have the same model that, we have a similar model, mandatory training, you will hit this gate, X, Y, Z, to be prepared for combat. I think that's important to some degree, but it takes the creativity and the focus from subordinate commanders from being able to execute that in their own formation. Like you said before we got in here, you said you got a training area out in Germany as a platoon leader, and you got to go out and train. And your left and right limit was, I guess, the commander's intent, and your NCOs who were seasoned and experienced, and you increased your capacity to kill somebody if you had to. That does not exist today in the form that it once did. That field was your canvas. You were the artist, and you could paint. We just give you the paint by numbers now, and you need to stay in the line with the color that we give you. It removes creativity and it removes focus.
Well, the paint by numbers isn't always a good solution.
It's not.
It doesn't give you the answer that you're looking for in every sense of the word.
No, because
Now, what we need is we do need uniformity of understanding,
Yes.
and uniformity in the sense that every unit has its battle drills, its formations, but beyond that, how the unit evolves and develops and what it produces is a function of leadership.
Yes.
And that leadership has to have some freedom of maneuver to extract the maximum potential. Is that right?
That's right. And how are you going to identify who your best units are from your worst?
Yes.
When you're all generally just seen in the same light, doing the same tasks, when you all go to the same combat training center, and your output from that exercise means nothing to your career. If you get massacred, you still go forward.
No, I know, and
you're given a script, and you're
that's really bad. Yeah, we spent a lot of money on these training centers, and I argued, we did, you can look up the RAND report, although it's been watered down to make people feel better, but my unit in 1993 in November, it was so exceptional that everybody said this is impossible. They couldn't have done that well. And the OPFOR at the time, at the end of our rotation, actually got off the vehicles, came over and congratulated us because we defeated them so successfully.
They love seeing that.
And it was a good experience, but I was told that it meant nothing.
It means nothing.
And they said, your real job is to come here and learn lessons. And I actually was told this by a general. If you come here and win, you're not learning any lessons. And I thought about that, and I said, well, if we're winning, isn't that in itself an indicator that we've done something well? Right. And see, that was unacceptable. And I watched people who walked in there and just were awful. The units did not perform well. The soldiers didn't have any use for the commander. They did what they were told, but they didn't care. And as a result, these people became generals. They went on to brigade command, and in fact, the analysts told me the worse you do at NTC is an indicator that you're probably going to get a brigade command. They said the only other indicators were whether or not you were an aide to a senior general or you were married to somebody's daughter or something else. And I said, well, that's just great.
It's sad to hear that. And I wish I could negate it and argue with what you're saying, but I can't based on personal experience.
What you're telling me is nothing's really changed since I went through.
Right. Nothing's changed. And the problem is I do acknowledge that we send folks to these exercises to lose and learn. But as an OCT, I've been an observer controller trainer for a while. You know the units that are bad in the beginning at first contact that get better versus the ones that just get worse. Not only can they not plan and execute properly, they can't even take care of themselves as individuals. They don't sleep, so everything just falls off. And at the end of the rotation, they have been reconstituted 3, 4, 5 times as a battalion or a brigade. I don't think that the person in command of such a debacle should be able to leave the National Training Center or wherever else unscathed from consequences. And those consequences don't even have to be, that they get permanently fired, but they should probably be pulled off and retrained a bit. We used to normalize, correct me if I'm wrong, you know more about this than I do. We used to normalize removing commanders, retraining them, and getting them back into the fight, maybe with another unit.
Oh, we did that during the war.
Right, why don't we do it anymore?
In World War I, for instance, we had this expression, canned. This guy got canned.
Yeah.
And that's because the U.S. Army Marshal established a place for general officers that were relieved, and it was in Cannes, in France. And so they would say, well, General so-and-so was canned. And Pershing was a very, very brilliant man. He really was. He was not a nice guy. He was hard. Not brutal. I mean, he was hard in the sense that you mentioned. He was not toxic.
Right.
He was just damn determined that everything was going to work. And so he had one of his West Point classmates who was a 2-star, and he brought him in because he knew him very well, and he said, I want you to go to Cannes, and I want you to interview these officers. And if I've made a mistake and I unjustifiably remove someone from command, you come back to me, tell me that, and I'll restore the man to his command. And so this man went there. And out of the 40 or so generals that he interviewed, and that's a lot of generals to remove in that short period of time. We only fought for 110 days in World War I, and we took 318,000 casualties. That's pretty rough. 110,000 dead. And he wanted to be just. And out of that number, I think there were only 2 that came back and said, these 2, one in particular, should never have been removed, and the other one was not well physically. So he said he didn't do anything wrong, he just is not well. So he was doing this. He actually relieved people before the war began because he knew he was dealing with a lot of people that didn't understand what they were up against, because we had come from the Philippines. That was the last big war, Philippine insurrection. And everyone was convinced that aimed rifle fire would win all wars because they were so good, and they missed quick-firing artillery. They missed machine guns, and they'd never experienced mines or barbed wire or any of these things.
We do that a lot, though. I mean, you think about Vietnam, and the Navy decided that dogfights were no longer a thing, and they removed guns from their aircraft and put missiles on them, and then they found out the hard way.
Yeah, you guys are going to get me started about the bayonet, too.
Yeah, there you go, the bayonet.
Tangent,
no, if we get focused on singular issues, we lose sight of the larger picture, which is to win the day, to win the wars the
and coming to terms with reality is difficult. It really is. One of the things that I tell people, they say, well, okay, you think this was great or that was great. Why did we go into World War II with 12 regiments of horse cavalry? Why hadn't we mechanized those?
Right.
And I try to explain that certainly there were generals that were diehards that really believed in the horse, and they were in the cavalry, obviously. One was John K. Herr, and he used to say an armored vehicle runs out of gas in a day or two. A horse takes days to die if you don't feed it. So stick with the horse. Okay, thanks, John. They eventually removed him and so forth. But the really big reason was that horses produced manure. in great quantities. And we had thousands of horses all over the Midwest and the West where the cavalry yards. All these cavalry yards used to be on the Mexican border. Everybody says, "Oh, we don't want military power on the Mexican border." And I say, everybody served on the Mexican border from 1846 to 1948.
It was normal.
Eisenhower, who was infantry, was there. MacArthur, who was an engineer, was there. Everybody served down there, but especially horses, obviously. And this huge accumulation of manure was a big business because it was all sold off to farmers. And farmers imported tons of this horse crap to fertilize their fields.
The racket.
And so every time, MacArthur raised the issue when he was chief of staff in 1929, he understood he could only get so far. So he said, well, let me buy 2 or 3 tanks. And they didn't want to fund that. Then you get Malin Craig, who becomes chief of staff. He faces the problem. He can't get rid of the horse cavalry and the horse artillery. Remember, they were in all these things. And replace it with motorized and it was all because of the manure.
Right.
And people look at me like, you're kidding. No, as people in Congress said, we need that manure. My constituents must have it. So now we live in a different world today where we've substituted other chemicals for good old manure. I hope the green crowd doesn't make us maintain horses again to create crap so
Well,
they can do
isn't
that.
that an issue
yeah, they
too, though?
might.
Is you look how long it took just to change something that seems so obvious to us now.
Yeah.
It took so long to steer the ship in a different direction.
But that's why I try to explain to people, it wasn't the fault of any of those generals. They could only do so much to begin with. Congress constrained them, and the presidents at the time, they weren't interested.
Yeah.
If the president's not interested, you know what happens? Nothing. Because the president is commander-in-chief, and if he doesn't have a secretary of defense who's interested, forget it.
Yeah, then you're
Those people drive everything. All change in the military is top-down, never bottom-up. It's rare that you get bottom-up. And usually, when it is bottom-up, it's in a war. And people are dying, and somebody says, hey, this works, get the word out to everybody. We did that to get out of Normandy with the hedges. We put devices on tanks to break down the hedges, invented by a sergeant, and demonstrated, and we adopted it. But that sort of thing doesn't happen in peacetime.
No. Simplifying our lives, though, would be good for the Secretary of Defense and his folks up there at the top to do. Taking away the distractions.
Well, tell us about the distractions you think need to go away.
So anything really in Army Regulation 350-1, I don't think needs to be there in order to make us a more lethal formation. I think anything that comes down from HQDA, Headquarters Department of the Army, that is going to be a mandatory training event that has nothing to do with killing people, shooting them or sticking a knife in their chest, I don't care. Right? I want to be able to look at subordinate commanders, talk about warfighting, make sure that they have the guidance and the left and right limits to execute training based on our regulations so we have some uniformity. But I want them to make their training schedules hour by hour, provide the predictability for their subordinates so that they know what they're doing day in and day out, and just get to the heart of the matter. And it's important that people understand at the top how to employ us, for example, as infantry or armor, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty clear from the war on terror that we were not utilized properly, right? We were killers who were supposed to be used to kiss babies, hand out HA kits, guard intersections, do long guard shifts at X, Y, or Z. That is not how we're supposed to be used. We are America's hammer.
Well, of course, you have to do what you're told.
We do. Stability operations are a part of it, true.
But the thing to keep in mind is that when you don't face a real enemy, an enemy that can threaten your existence,
right.
In other words, that can overrun and destroy the forward operating base, then people get lazy.
They do.
Well, aviation's faced the same thing. I mean,
and leadership becomes, send me in the PowerPoint slides, and will brief me on the next mission.
That's all it is. And the problem, though, is not just, yes, we're American soldiers, we fight where we're told, and we win where we fight, right? That's what we do. And if we have to do stability operations for a little while, so be it. But that should be, in my opinion, the exception rather than the rule. Mm-hmm. We should be a primary hammer and an alternate velvet glove, I guess. Mm-hmm. The issue isn't just the use of us, it's what happened during the war on terror that I think everything we're experiencing now is run downstream of that, which is the investigation culture of just pulling the trigger. The simple act of pulling the trigger in Baghdad was going to lead to an Army Regulation 15-6 official investigation. And that was sold to us as an attempt to protect the civilian population and the perception that we were not being too hard, and the soldiers that pulled the trigger. And that led to a huge problem for us where people were just afraid to shoot back, and they were skittish. I will tell one story about a good buddy of mine, and I won't mention his name. I was in East Baghdad in 2008. We were at Cop 759, and there's a route called Predators that kind of runs from, around Pluto all the way up. East Baghdad by the Diyala Canal, right, Diyala River. And it was beaten into us before we had deployed that 15-6 investigation would happen, and you could be,
removed,
hung out to dry, right? So we had our rules of engagement was you had to have positive identification over whatever you were going to shoot at. All right, I get it, cool, sure, it's counterinsurgency, fine. The problem is the enemy figures out real quick what our rules of engagement are whenever they change. So if they went out there to the road to put an IED in front of you and ran away, well, you didn't have PIT. You couldn't shoot anything, right? So when I'm at this cop at night, I'm just hearing explosion after explosion.
COP?
A combat outpost,
Right.
excuse me, acronyms.
Yep.
I'm hearing explosion after explosion. It's like 14, 15 explosions. And come to find out the next morning, thank God nobody in my buddy's platoon was killed. It was 2 tanks, 2 Brads on a convoy. They ate 15 explosively formed penetrators.
Wow.
That went straight through their tanks, straight through their Brads. Luckily, no one was killed, but I asked him, and he was real shaken up, my buddy. He said, yeah, we just didn't have PID, so we didn't shoot back. Like, they took away our ability to engage known, likely, and suspected positions. And
so they couldn't defend themselves.
it's like taking teeth out of a wolf or a lion. What's the point, right?
Yeah,
We went way too far in the direction of nonviolence versus violence. Now, we're infantry and we're armor. We're used for a specific purpose. You can't feed us meat in training and then all of a sudden when we go into the fight, give us vegetables and expect us to behave the same. I don't know if that's the right metaphor to describe this, but I think it creates a problem when you're using the wrong tool for the wrong job.
Well, you have a similar problems in aviation, certainly with the attack.
Absolutely. Well, not with the so much. I mean, yeah, the attack side of it too, but I mean, in the air assault side as well, we would have to positively identify somebody that had the potential to directly threaten the aircraft and was in the act of threatening the aircraft, because. But this also depended on the commander you had. We had commanders. I won't name him, but in 2010, if we were involved in some sort of action where we fired rounds, there wasn't much discussion about it because that's what we were there to do, despite the regulations that were in place. But in 2015 and 16, under a different commander, that was completely and totally different. And so I had an incident where I had to sit down and explain myself in a sworn statement. As one of the pilots I was the air mission commander in a flight of 2. And that particular instance, there really was no reason to explain myself. My crew was back safe. We got everybody back to where they were supposed to be. I did my job. But when you create an environment where soldiers, doesn't matter, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, where they're afraid to do their job, even when their job could get them killed, they will have second thoughts and they will second guess themselves and they'll fail at their task. And that failure, maybe they never come home. Maybe that failure is we talked about the suicide piece before. Maybe they commit suicide. Maybe that failure leads to other issues. And when we're dealing with the enemies of the United States, when we're dealing with life and death, there is no time, oftentimes, to stop and assess the threat.
Yeah, it's a split second.
Yeah,
Adam?
I want our leaders to understand that to use us as part of your instruments of national power for anything overseas, to consider what our primary job is, what we do in the infantry, the armor, the artillery, the attack aviation, whatever, right? We kill people. We close with and destroy the enemy, right? And if you start sending us over there to be police or something else, we'll do it. We're not going to be any good at it. We'll try real hard, but the commitment required to put us overseas, I would like it, if I could request that from our higher ups, I would like it to be considered much more carefully. We're not an easy button to go do whatever you want. Yes, we will do whatever you order if it's legal, moral, and ethical. I got that as a soldier. But if you really want the best out of us, and the commitment and the will of the American people is behind you, then order us to go kill people, if that's what the job is.
Well, you just hit on something that I wanted to ask you both about. And that is, most of us think that the government, and when I say the government, I'm talking about Congress and presidents, over the last 25 to 30 years, have not done a particularly good job of justifying the loss of American blood and treasure overseas. They just haven't.
No.
And what would you tell the president and congressmen about how to use military power? Not so much that, but if you're going to do it, then the justification should involve what?
The absolute ire and determination of the American people. Like that I think is the thing that's missing. One of the things that I remember hearing in 2012 that hurt me to no end was when I came back from my third tour. I talked to a woman that I knew back in Boston, and I was, she's like, "Where have you been?" I was like, I just got back from Afghanistan. And she and everyone in the room were like, "We're still over there?" Like, if we got people asking those questions, we're probably not fighting the way that we're not being used the way that we're supposed to. And I think that when the will of the American people is behind some kind of foreign intervention, we've had pretty positive effects. World War I, World War II,
Korea.
Even you could argue Korea, we would win. But like, when it's a slow burn type of thing, and there's no clear objectives and outcomes,
That's what I
for
was
us,
going to get at. Yeah.
we end up sitting there on a long guard shift for 12, 15 months, languishing and getting shot at. And that is not the appropriate way to use our forces. So I think that if I was to give them some advice, make sure that the absolute will of the American people is on your side. And I don't think that that was the case.
And the
earlier.
objective needs to be clear and concise. It can't be muddied in politics and mired in the talk of the military-industrial complex and those types of things. There can't be these ulterior motives to it. It has to be clear and concise. We have to have an objective. We have to execute on that objective, and then we leave.
Well, you realize that there's a factor in this equation, and you've mentioned it. It's called the American people. And most Americans on any given day don't pay attention to what happens beyond our borders. It's not interesting to them. And so one of the things that I noticed after 2001, I think it was also true in 91, but not quite as acute, is that there was this great sensitivity to casualties. It said, we can take casualties. We can lose 500 men over the space of 6 or 8 weeks, but we can't lose 500 men in a day. If you lose 500 men in a day, then the spotlight is going to come and shine on us, and the American people are going to ask hard questions.
Right.
We don't want them to ask any hard questions.
Well, really, it goes even further. It goes all the way back to Vietnam, and it's not so much just the casualties. It's the casualties with no clear objective.
You're just dying for nothing.
You're just over there killing American soldiers or American service members for no reason. They're there, but what's their objective? I think the American public could stomach the loss of our treasure, the blood of our fighting men, if there was an objective to those sacrifices.
Well, it may be interesting to you, but the Russian president Putin has faced these same things, and he's had to frame the mission in eastern Ukraine very carefully because there was undoubtedly a threat to Russia. We built this army up, and it was trained for one thing: to attack Russia and kill Russians. And they finally attacked when they gave up any hope that we would listen to them and heed any of their warnings or concerns. And they had been telling us for 20 years, don't move NATO to our borders. You promised you wouldn't do that. We've asked you repeatedly, don't do it. And of course they did. And he's had trouble because Russians have said, we should do what we did in the Second World War. Just kill all these people and march west. And he's tried to tell them that's not what we want to do. We don't want to kill all of these Ukrainians because we regard them as related to us. They're not very different from us. They were part of our nation state for many, many years. So we want to win this. We'll destroy the Ukrainian army. We want to denazify it. You know, we want a neutral Ukraine, but we don't want to kill unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And that's been a tough road to walk. It's worked. They've won. And the Russian people have been behind this from the beginning, and they're behind it today because they understand it. We never really explained very clearly what we were doing in any of these places.
Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. The other thing is, you know, Eisenhower got us out of Korea because he said, look, the American people are not going to support a war that drags us into Manchuria against China. And that's what the next step was. Right. If we're going to win this, we have to defeat China. He said, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Americans don't want to do that. So we ended up with this 38 parallel, which wasn't perfect. But he understood the limits of American patience. And then later on, you know, we stretched it to the breaking point in Vietnam. I think we stretched it to the breaking point in Iraq and Afghanistan as well.
We went way past the breaking point,
Yeah.
just in my own opinion.
Yeah.
We went way past the breaking point.
And then of course, you're pointing to what happens inside these armies or forces because the generals, they're now accustomed to the PowerPoint slide analysis.
Yes.
And issuing orders where everybody's under the spotlight to do something. And if you accidentally kill or 2 or 3 more people than you should have, you're going to be executed for it. They throw you under the bus. It destroys trust in the chain of command. Nobody believes what the officers say.
I was gonna.
That's what.
And that's you're exactly right about the American people and their the skittishness about casualties starting in the 90s or so. I mean, we're reflections of the culture we come from in uniform and that's the thing, right?
Which is not all bad, by the way.
It's not all bad. It's a good thing. To some degree, it's a good thing. But like when it comes to a war of national survival and serious commitment in battle that requires some, unfortunately, of us to die, it doesn't sit well with them. And so the problem is when we're making tactical decisions now, or training decisions or whatever, the attempt to save even one soldier, you know, leads to a very timid, risk avoidance type of plan where you will not be able to fully commit to victory. And so in an attempt to put everyone in bubble wrap and save one soldier, you're going to lose them all, or damn close to it if we're going toe-to-toe to the enemy. Because, I mean, you know, characteristics of the offense, right? Surprise, concentration, audacity, and tempo. The audacity piece has been taken out of our formation because we can't lose a single person.
Yeah.
It's because of the color and the lines thing you talked about, paint by the numbers.
It's paint by the numbers, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I've advocated for a long time, I'd like to know what you think, is to put the United States Army in control of the Mexican border. Because we controlled it for 100 years, all intents and purposes.
Common sense,
Yeah.
I think, right?
And right now, the cartels are better armed in most cases than the police and the National Guard.
They're better armed than the Taliban and the Jaish al-Mahdi that we were fighting overseas.
Yeah.
And we are under fire periodically.
Yeah.
But it's not just that. I mean, if you think about if any other force or any other foreign entity had ever killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, we would have immediately been embroiled in some sort of conflict.
It's back to what we discussed earlier. We lose 110, 120,000 people a year to fentanyl poisoning.
Exactly.
But in the public's mind, it's not connected.
No, it's not.
And that's a mistake.
But the thing is that if they saw, say, the Chinese landed on the West Coast and just wiped out 120,000 people, what would happen? The American people would demand that we respond.
Of course.
But when it's somebody's son states away, somebody's daughter at the university, downtown, it doesn't mean as much.
Doesn't register.
It doesn't register
You know,
the same way.
it's really kind of messed up. I was just thinking, you know, being a soldier on the southern border, you know, what would it feel like being on our own soil, looking at someone else's and protecting the nation that we're
supposed to protect?
Like, you think about, like, that's your job, right?
Right.
Yes, we do foreign interventions, but I have never, in my entire career of 20-something years, stood on American soil and looked at an adversary from across a border. It's always been some distant land. You know, like I could get behind that kind of mission, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
absolutely. Well,
I think
Trump always
we all could.
Trump
Yeah.
always talks about the big, beautiful ocean that separates us, but,
Yeah.
but we have our conflicts in our own backyard. At our
Many
back
of
door.
them.
Remember, he also has his critics, and you've got what I call the ankle biters. So whenever you try to do something that makes sense, you've got an ocean of lawyers standing there trying to attack you, saying this is brutal.
It's
this
funny
is
that you say that.
inhumane, and so
You're gonna get me
Very
started.
recently, very recently, I was told by an individual that in my case, and is that they would see what they could do. They would give it to legal, and see what they were able to do. And an individual responded to me that was actually helping me with this and said, "Lawyers don't lead; leaders lead."
Yes, it takes a leader to be able to say, thank you for your recommendation. No, execute. Like, what's the point of being that high up if you can't see an injustice and fix it immediately, where you have to just send it to a lawyer and filter it through? It's not always necessary.
Or your guys come back shot up, and you have to go talk to a lawyer before you can go get the people that shot your guys up.
No.
that's ridiculous.
What's
So it got bad in GWAT.
what's the
bad.
point of the fight? Why are we, and to his credit, President Trump talked about using the military to push back the cartels and stop this influx of drugs, and look at the criticism he got in the media for it. Using our military on our own soil? Are you crazy? Can you believe that? Why would we ever do that?
Well, I had a lieutenant that served with me right after he graduated from West Point. Went through Airborne Ranger, and he showed up. And he was a great lieutenant, did a wonderful job. Years later, he was a battalion commander. He got his battalion command. I was very pleased. He probably told me. I've tried to follow people that were with me, and I hear from a lot of people that I served with, fortunately. Mm-hmm. And he called me and he said, I'm great. I'm going to Afghanistan. I've got this mission. He described it. I'm going to be doing this and this and this. I said, that's good. He said, I got a lot of plans, and this is what I want to do and everything else. And I listened. I said, David, that's wonderful. But my perception right now of what's happening in Afghanistan, I feel obligated to tell you that I don't think it's rewarding for you to be that aggressive. If you're that aggressive, you're probably going to be punished for it, not rewarded for it. And I agree with you in what you want to do. So think very carefully when you get over there about the orders that you're given. Obviously, you want to obey those and execute those, but I would like to see you survive, because I don't think you're going to find the environments conducive to the kinds of things you want to do. And of course,
But
he contacted me 90 days later, and he said, boy, were you right. Thank God I didn't do any of this stuff.
Well, that survival is more, now it's not a survival, bringing your guys home alive. It's, a leader thinks about how their career will survive.
Yes.
It
And
put
how
us
will-
in an impossible situation.
How their
And it's
career
true
will
in the
be.
Navy. I received a note this morning from a senior warrant officer from the Navy, brilliant guy, and he just came back from the Pacific Fleet where he's doing some work over there on contract. He's retired, but he spent over 20 years in the Navy. And he said, I'm so sick of this, something goes wrong and the captain's relieved. He said, Halsey and Nimitz were both relieved as young officers. And if we treated them the way we treat our officers today, how would things have turned out in the Pacific War?
We won't have, if we don't give the latitude to help folks out understand mistakes, and if we just take one person that makes a mistake and remove them, and we do that at echelon, all the way from top to bottom, what kind of formation are we going to have? They're not going to be resilient. They're not going to be, able to handle their first loss, whether it's a personal one or a battlefield one, in the way that we want them to, which is to get back on the horse and keep moving. I think Patton said, he doesn't judge folks by how high they can climb, but how high they bounce when they've been dropped in their ass. We've taken that out of
It's gone, yeah.
yeah, everything we do. So, we talk about resilience and being, solid war fighters, but we, because of lawfare, have taken the mechanism out to retrain somebody. Like if you lose command now, or you're taken out of position, you won't ever get back.
There's no recourse to get back.
You
There's
won't
none.
get back. Like, you'll just be gone, right? And that's a problem.
There's a lot
for
of
so many
injustice
different
in the
reasons.
system, as we know.
There
Some
is.
of the best enlisted and officers that I've served under did not have perfect careers,
Huh.
but they understood their failures, they owned them, and they moved forward, and they were the best leaders. And one of my first NCOs before I was in the Army, was in the Navy. he had these blocks of ink on his face and some stuff done on his arms because he had been a gang member in Los Angeles, California. And he had gotten a girl pregnant, and instead of going further down that road of failure, he decided to join the Navy. And he passed through the ranks quickly. He retired as a command master chief, and he had that same mentality because of where he had come from. He had made mistakes that when he saw other people that had potential make mistakes, he did not do what was necessary to ruin their career. Instead, he encouraged those people and gave them the opportunity and the tools necessary to become the next batch of leaders. You made the joke out there that old school Army, every sergeant major had at least 3 DUIs.
Or Article 15s for something.
Yeah, and that was so true. It was not uncommon to have a sergeant major stand in front of you or a command master chief and tell a story about how he got busted down from E6 to E5 and then made his way back.
It's zero defect now. I have a soldier who was my Bradley driver when I was a platoon leader, and before we went to Iraq, he got caught with a fake ID at a club outside of Fort Hood. And it was handled within the chain of command. This was a good kid. He lived in moldy, trashy, temporary barracks, and he wanted to fit into the unit, so he went out with the troops, and a lot of them got fake IDs. I had just got to the platoon, so I didn't realize how bad the problem was, because all the veterans had PTSD from the previous tour where they weren't allowed to shoot people. So anyway, they go out, he gets caught with a fake ID, he's 18 years old, good kid. My platoon sergeant decides to deal with that with the first sergeant and in consult with me, and we decided that we were going to kind of keep it under the table, but he was going to work for us for the next 6 months, and we were going to train him and talk to him about what he did wrong, and he ended up being an outstanding soldier. Now, I talked to a JAG buddy of mine who I consider to be...
JAG meaning?
Judge Advocate General, an Army lawyer, who I consider to be a freedom-loving patriot who hates the lawfare stuff too. But when I ran this vignette by him last week, I was like, what would you do if you found out someone had a fake ID, and what would you tell the commander? What would you do? Oh, you'd throw the book at him, Article 15 at least. That's just how it is. So think about this kid who ended up serving with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan as a squad leader, went out there and took the fight to the enemy. You know, if he had got the book thrown at him at that formative age, he could have killed himself.
Yes.
He could have, you know, so we have really, after the Fort Hood Independent Review, which we could talk about at length someday, but like that really, I think, caused a lot of problems and overcorrected. And
that review was about what?
That review was about stemming from the unfortunate murder of Specialist Vanessa Guillen. What was that, like 2018 or something like that?
I don't know.
Yeah. It was a few years back, and it triggered a review of the command climate at Fort Hood. And there were 71 recommendations that came out of that from the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee, and the Army adopted all of them. But the problems that it tried to solve, in my estimation, really just kind of made a lot of the situations worse, like the one that I just described.
Were they all punitive? In other words, they were penalizing, punishing people more?
Yes.
They turned it up.
You have no latitude as a commander to make decisions anymore when it comes to, like a commander's inquiry. You probably did some of those when you were in command, right? Like, let's just ask some questions. What if you didn't have that mechanism when you were in command and the lawyer said, no, 15-6 investigation every time? Think about what that would have done to you.
No,
you wouldn't
impossible.
You would not have been able to focus on warfighting because you'd be just mired in investigations all the time.
Well, I refuse to do that sort of thing.
Right.
And the generals don't like that. They really like the people that are punitive. They want to take punitive action. That's good man.
Always.
Punish, good man. And I tended to take the position that 90% of the problems should be solved by non-commissioned officers.
Agreed.
And only a very few required officer intervention, and that was not popular.
Talking about that murder at Fort Hood, when you take somebody like that in a tragic incident like that, and you just turn it into 71 bullet points that you're suggesting to the Army for correction, you just downgraded the importance of that murder, that individual that lost their lives, because now they're just AAR comments. They're after action.
Well, look at the changes that have been made about sexual assault. that the commanders is taken completely out of the system.
Huge problem. Sexual harassment complaints now, through the roof, and whoever you sling the arrow at, it's going to hit him and kill him. And it does, and there's no real penalty for slinging a false one.
No.
So it's a great technique if you're not having a good time in the Army to deflect problems away from yourself and throw it on others. And this is taking up tens of thousands of man-hours to investigate these frivolous complaints.
And most of them are not justified.
They're not.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem that I don't think the American people understand.
No.
And this is a third rail, right? No one wants to talk about this because it was tragic what happened at Fort Hood, and we want to make sure it never happens again. But just like we have with the Commander's Assessment Program, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And what people don't understand about warriors, and I'm sure you could comment on this way more than I can, sir, but when you have someone get in trouble and you build them back up, they tend to
You
be some of the
create loyalty.
best soldiers
Of course.
you'll ever have. And right now, it's you're gone, no matter what. And I want that to be understood, and that's why the suicide rates are so high, because in the military, you are guilty until proven innocent. And what does that do to someone who is innocent?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, think
You
about
lose
that.
hope.
You raised your right hand to say, I will give you my country up to and including the cost of my entire life. And then they come back and tell you, well, you're under investigation for this. You're flagged. You cannot get any positive thing happen to you until this is complete. Think about what that does to the psyche of someone who is legitimately innocent. They
Hasn't done anything
kill
wrong.
themselves like a Japanese samurai committing seppuku. You know, they've lost their honor. Because we're different. We are built a little different than the American citizenry.
We're
And
supposed to
honor
be different.
drives us.
Yeah, we're supposed to be different. Yeah.
So I think we need lawyers commanders to have some spine and take recommendations from lawyers, not orders from them. And the last thing I'll say, though, about this is that I never want to feel the way I did in Afghanistan and Kandahar in 2010, where I'm pre-command captain in the talk, looking at my reconnaissance feed, and I hear my people in contact on the highway, and I see who's shooting at them, and my S3 tells me I have to get on the phone with JAG to make sure it's okay to shoot back.
I know. Well,
Like-
listen, this is not just you.
You know?
In 2001, after the towers went down in September, we intervened in Afghanistan. We actually intervened in November, and this happened. There was a general officer at the Combined Air, the KOC, Combined Air Operations Command, in the headquarters, and he called General Tommy Franks, I think it was. Is that right? Tommy Franks? Yeah, I guess.
CENTCOM commander?
I guess so, yeah. And he sent CENTCOM commander. And he said, we think a group of white SUVs coming out of Kabul. And the voice prints on the radio, a 90% probability that Osama bin Laden is in that convoy, along with Mullah Muhammad and some other people. And we have a Hellfire missile primed, ready overhead. We'd like to attack it. And Tommy Franks said, wait, I need to talk to the attorney. And it came back some 30 to 40 minutes later. He said, you have permission to shoot. And of course,
It's too late.
it was too late. Now, when Secretary Rumsfeld, and I don't care what people say about him, I mean, you can find fault with him for all sorts of reasons, but at the time, he was so angry, he beat on the walls of his office. He was angry that this had happened. Why didn't he pull the trigger on that? Now, some people will say, well, we never intended that. That's other stuff. But that's how high it reaches. So, unfortunately, it has become more problematic now than ever.
It's disheartening.
And you have a whole corps of officers who are attorneys who are trained, and they do exercise veto power, almost like political officers did in the old Soviet military. So the commander could only do what the political officer said was justified.
It's not risk mitigation anymore, like you said before. It's risk avoidance. So the risk mitigation in that particular scenario is you had 90% certainty that he was in that convoy. There's your mitigating factor right there.
Mm-hmm.
So you were 90% certain that this was the right move to make. But instead of using that as a mitigator, you used it as veto power or in your case, when your guys were being engaged.
But remember, that's how he got where he is.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
And those are the people that we like and we promote and advance. And we regard anyone else as, well, we can't afford these kinds of rogues or standouts that may not be out there. So, we have to have people that are going to comply.
They're labeled toxic.
I feel like all of us are used to break open in time of war and then cast aside in time of peace.
Yeah,
It's not a good thing because it's not really true. Just because you don't do everything that the lawyer tells you to do or whatever your chain of command says doesn't mean you're a bad officer.
No.
But, again, you've got generations of people. I'm talking about 2001. And I saw plenty of evidence for this back in 1990 and 91. And I was astonished.
Really? Back that far?
Oh, yes. I was astonished because
Well,
I remember talking to my assistant 3, and he was a very good man. And I said, I've been doing this since 1976. So I've waited 14, 15, almost 16 years, a little less than 16 years to do what I've been professionally trained to do. So why wouldn't anybody want to do that? Why are people looking for excuses not to attack? Why are people looking for excuses to stop? Everybody should be, on fire.
Yeah.
And we're not.
Yeah.
In fact, the opposite was the case.
you have to have clarity for that too, though.
So,
And if
we've been breeding these, sort of workhorses that pull wagons, not racehorses, not war horses. And, somebody said one day to Frederick the Great, why did you promote this young colonel to make him a major general? They didn't have 1 star in the old Prussian system. He's awfully young, and he's only been in a couple of battles. Yeah. He said, you need experience in your generals. Fred the Great looked at the man and said, experience is overrated. If experience were the principal criterion, I would make all of my war horses, the people that draw the artillery and the wagons, those horses, they have more experience than anybody else. They've been on all the campaigns. Right. But I'm not going to put them in command.
That's exactly right.
But, this is why several people, a lot of people argued privately, that's what you use the training centers for. Yeah. You're trying to separate the slugs from the people who are likely to do something, and the fact that works, but in the wrong way.
Exactly, sir. And not only do we have the training centers, but now that the division is the unit of action in the Army, we have War Sim. It's digital, and they fight war games. But no one gets fired for getting crushed in that either, in the Milwaukee Gap scenario.
And somebody should be asked, why did you do this, Colonel?
Yeah. But no, they do
general
ask.
Or whatever.
They do ask, sir. There's an AR, and everything's laid bare, and the general or whoever's in charge of the echelon that got slaughtered will be able to say what he did and then talk about what they can do better. And it's approached from just learn from this and get better perspective, right? Like, it's not really something that you're being graded on. We just want to make you better. And I love that to some degree, but I would like people to have iterations doing something like that and then test on it to where we're not going to AAR this one. You're just going to fight and you're going to win. Or you're going to lose, or you're going to give a good effort at least, and you're going to be graded on that for your division command or corps command potential. This is our system of record. If without a war of national survival, I don't see another way to get it done. How would you test somebody?
Well, the problem with the war of survival is by then it may be too late.
It may be too late. Yeah, it's too late.
That's a problem.
So the thing I want to avoid at all costs is getting bloodied in first contact. I want to win the first battle of the next war. And it's the American way to lose that battle, usually.
Yeah, that's what people preach. I don't see the need for it. I think we should be able to win it.
We should win.
But it's not a popular view.
No, it's almost like I'm talking crazy here. And it's only going to get worse with this commander's assessment program. And I say that because 54% of eligible people that can attend it are turning it down because they don't believe in it. 54%. That's as of a task and purpose article that came out in December, and people can look at that.
54%.
54%. And it's mired in scandal because of what happened with the General Hamilton case, where a bottom 1% officer on the OML went to cap, failed it twice, and was still moved into the top 8th of all potential commanders who would come out on the slate.
But wasn't that sort of a racially based or affirmative action related?
Sir, your guess is as good as mine. If you read the IG report, it alludes to that. But the chief of staff of the Army was ultimately responsible for taking that out, or his office, taking that officer and moving her into a position superior to others.
Using.
Well, that's the kind of thing that has to stop.
The faith in the process is what I'm saying is gone. So real warfighters are seeing, well, a shrink is going to call me crazy. I'm going to get jumped in line anyway by someone less qualified. Why would I go? And you know how it is on command climate surveys where, like, if you get one-off complaints here and there, you kind of write them off. But when you start seeing a trend, now you know what you have to action as a commander and get after it. If 54% of your qualified people to go to this course are turning it down, we have a problem in the Army, and we need to get it fixed. And this program needs to be suspended immediately, pending a further review of its usefulness. I firmly believe that, based on all the warfighters I've seen that have been kind of thrown out.
I sincerely hope that Secretary of Defense Hegseth and President Trump, hopefully, will see some of this, because I think it will help them craft the policies that they want us to pursue in the future. Finally, the man leading our veterans program is Bill Bala, a Navy veteran. Please contact him if you have any questions. And veterans in general, please call us, talk to us, and hopefully join us. We want you. We need you in our ranks. Our country, our choice is about uniting this country and moving it forward. And we need your help. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.